Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arreola, and today I am going to talk to you about police militarization. Police militarization can be characterized as a local police force using military equipment and tactics in order to be better equipped for violent crime. However, this has the unintended effect of making the police department in question to look more like an occupying military force, and can even subconsciously make the police force more violent. Police forces weren't always meant to be militarized. For example, the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 in England had proclaimed that the newly minted police force was to wear blue uniforms in order to contrast with the red being worn by the British Army at the time. Sometimes you could say that there's even been reverse militarization, in which a military force has adopted a civilian technology. For example, these two New York Police Department officers are carrying a Thompson submachine gun in the 1920s, while in the 1940s you could see these two U.S. Army soldiers carrying approximately the same weapon with some modifications for military use. Now, a police department may have a choice or not to militarize. However, most departments would choose to militarize or to take a more militaristic approach to policing after a high-profile incident within their own jurisdiction, or a jurisdiction within their state, or even an incident that takes place that makes national news. For example, in 1986 in Miami-Dade, Florida, 7 FBI agents tracked down and stopped 2 suspected robbers. The 2 suspected robbers were armed to the teeth, so to speak, and opened fire on the FBI agents, injuring 5 and killing 2 of them. The remaining FBI agents were finally able to eliminate the two robbers, but of course that isn't really an ideal condition to have done it under. Another common example would probably be the North Hollywood shootout. The North Hollywood shootout in 1997, wherein 2 robbers attempted to rob a bank in North Hollywood, and they held back police officers for several hours because the police officers were unable to penetrate the bulletproof vests that the robbers were wearing at the time. And meanwhile, the robbers were having a field day, so to speak, being able to fire through the doors of the police vehicles. In an interview with CNN, an ex-SWAT LAPD officer mentioned that had changed how the police now have equipment in their vehicles. For example, the doors now in most LAPD vehicles are lined with Kevlar, which is a bullet-resistant fabric, and most vehicles are equipped with a M4 or an M16 in order to be able to take out a threat such as the 2 robbers. Of course, there would be a good reason why not to militarize. The most obvious one is it makes you look like an occupying force of military, as you can see in my example with these Oregon Sheriff's Department SWAT team looking very similar to this military police officer in Iraq. This, of course, would alienate the citizenry into making them think that you're not a very approachable person, so they would be less likely to approach you whenever something goes wrong, for example, which is the opposite of community policing. And it was also discovered by a Washington Post article that police officers who had military equipment were more likely than not to get involved in violent confrontations. They figured this out by looking through records and finding out that police forces that used military equipment were more likely to kill dogs than police departments that did not use military equipment, and they extrapolated that this would mean that they would also be more likely to kill fellow man. Now that I told you the why, I should tell you the how. In 1997, the House of Representatives passed the National Defense Authorization Act, in which the line 1033, which is why this is called the 1033 Initiative, authorizes the government to transfer military equipment to federal and state police forces for counterterrorist and counter-drug operations. Another example of a government bill that has become law that expands police powers would be in 2001, just after the collapse of the Twin Towers, the USA Patriot Act, which USA Patriot standing for Uniting and Strengthening America, by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, in which they plan to do it by expanding police powers, as I just said, and it would make it easier for police forces to, for example, not use warrants when looking for suspected terrorists, which would have been a violation of posse comitatus if it were done by military forces. Now, militarization police has been on the news several times in the past. The most recent reason would be the 2020 protest across the nation. Now, these protests were caused in effect by police brutality, in which a police officer killed George Floyd and other police officers just stood by and allowed it to happen, which had angered the population of Baltimore and also sparked more protests across the nation, including Baltimore, and Los Angeles and Portland. Now, across the nation, especially in Los Angeles, for a more local example, they had employed the National Guard in order to keep the officers and the population safe, but this, of course, would lead to more confrontation because it kind of proved the protesters right, in which the police were militarized and prone to use violence. And I hope you had a good time listening to my presentation, and I hope you all have a good night.